This is the Protestant Libertarian Podcast, a project of the Libertarian Christian Institute and part of the Christians for Liberty Network. I really hope that you guys enjoy today's show. All right, guys, welcome to another episode of the Protestant Libertarian Podcast. My guest today is Jordan Bush. Jordan is a Christian and the executive director of Thank God for Bitcoin Media. He is also one of the authors of the book, Thank God for Bitcoin, The Creation, Corruption, and Redemption of Money. He formerly served as church planting missionary and pastor in Montevideo. Am I pronouncing that right?
Montevideo.
In Uruguay, and is a proud husband of one and father of four so far. Today, we are going to talk about money, the Federal Reserve, and how Christians ought to think about these very complex issues. Jordan, welcome to the Protestant Libertarian Podcast.
Hey, man, thanks for having me.
I have been wanting someone to come on and talk about this issue for a very long time, so I'm extremely excited to have you here. You got a really interesting background story. So before we get into there, just tell us a little bit about your background and what you do.
Yeah. So basically, if you would have told me 10 years ago that I'd be doing this, I would have told you were a moron. And that I had never, this is not where I thought, my life would lead, but here we are in God's providence. So basically I went to, grew up in a Christian family, went to Bible college, wanted to go in and be a missionary. And so my wife and I got married and we started raising support to go to Uruguay to plant a church there. It took us about 3 years to raise support. And then we spent about 7 years in Uruguay. And so we were able to plant a church. We ended up merging our church with another church plant that was actually sent by Alistair Begg's church in Ohio, near Cleveland. And so then shortly thereafter, for a number of reasons that probably won't get into today, but like a number of reasons, we ended up just basically coming back to the States and kind of regrouping. And then after about a year, we just basically came to the conclusion that we weren't going to go back to Uruguay. And so right around that point, I'd been involved in Bitcoin for a little bit, and then that kind of led to my current role with TGFB. So.
Yeah, that sounds great, man. Well, you are an expert on all things Bitcoin and finance, and I wanted you to talk about these issues because over the last couple of years, as I've been studying economics and reading more economic literature, it's become obvious to me that central banking really is kind of like the fundamental flaw in our economic system, but it's something that almost nobody knows anything about. So the United States Central Bank is the Federal Reserve. Just lay it out for my audience. What is the Federal Reserve?
Yeah, so the Federal Reserve is neither federal nor does it really have reserves. So this is the first faulty advertising of it, but it's basically a private bank, an enormous private bank that was founded about 100 years ago. And its basic goal is to be a bank that kind of operates on a national level, that basically has no oversight for what they're doing. Nobody knows who's officially involved. It's really this shadowy institution that's the most powerful banking entity in the world. So again, there's a lot of confusion about what it is. Most people think it's actually a federal entity. It has official governing authority, and it does not. It's a private entity. But then again, their policy decisions that they make about a number of things, but most consequentially, interest rates really affect everything else that goes on economically within society. The cost of capital determines so much of the reality that we live every day. So that's kind of the best, the one way to articulate it. Again, we'll probably unpack some more ways to articulate it, especially through like a Christian lens. But it's a real big bank.
Yeah. Well, and a lot of people hear the term Federal Reserve. And honestly, I took an economics class when I was in graduate school, actually, for the first time in my entire life. And until that point, I had never heard of the Federal Reserve. Not once in my life had anyone explain that to me. And the way that it was presented in the economic textbook that I was reading, which was just kind of a middle of the road economics textbook, was just simply that it's a national bank and that the government has to control the supply of money because it's government money. No big deal, right? But a lot of people don't understand that it's much more complicated than that. And I think one of the issues that I would like for you to explain real quick to my audience is who runs the Federal Reserve. Like a lot of people think, well, it's just a part of the federal government, so they must do it. But it's not quite. It doesn't quite work that way.
Yeah, it doesn't work that way. And again, I would love to answer that question, but literally, I mean, like we don't know who runs the Federal Reserve. Like we can go back and historically find out who is involved in its founding, and it's a lot of names that are still around in banking. Again, and a lot of names that there's conspiracy theories told around some of these names. But basically, it was founded about 100 years ago. The stated purpose was we wanted to prevent some of the financial crises that were happening. There'd been a number of runs on the bank due to the fact that the United States operated on a gold standard, and so when you run into issues and everyone tries to go get their money out at the same time, it can cause problems. And so the stated goal of the Federal Reserve was to bring some stability. Thankfully, we haven't experienced any banking crises since 1913, when I can't even keep a straight face. Of course, we had the worst financial crisis in American history have happened all since then. This has not served to actually serve its stated goal. But even bigger, if you get down to really, again, it's one thing to say, oh, we're doing this for the good of the country. In reality, there was a lot of selfish incentives. One of the things when the Federal Reserve was created, there was something called the wildcat banking era, and so there was new banks popping up all over the place. And so the creation of the Federal Reserve helped to limit some of the power and limit some of the expansion of this new creation of banks, because all these new banks would be competition for the existing bankers. And so they wanted to create something to cap that competition. And so, this is how it works in lots of economic sectors. You bring in government regulation oversight to kind of maintain your monopoly. And so that's in large part what happened with the Federal Reserve.
Well, let's talk about central banking more broadly, because central banking is a product of a particular historical context. It's an idea that gained a lot of traction in the 19th century, and a lot of countries around the world today have central banks. And so a lot of people just take it for granted that a government needs to have one. You talked a little about interest rates and some of those other issues that are related to central banking. Just walk us through the process that a central bank goes through to control the nation's money supply. How does it operate as a central bank?
Yeah, now some of this is dependent on the specific nation, but in large part, the Federal Reserve creates money out of thin air through the issuance of loans. Now, this is another thing, that the Federal Reserve is by no means alone in doing this. Monetary creation, there's the Federal Reserve is part of the monetary creation, but today, a lot of the monetary creation that happens is done through other private banks as well. So in the primary way that happens is through the issuance of new loans. And this is something that blows a lot of people's minds, that a lot of people don't realize, is that when now that we're off of a gold standard, we're off of some sort of hard, tangible, scarce backing to the United States currency. There's really, like, when loans are issued, up until this point, when loans were issued, you'd say, okay, all these people have their deposits. And so we'll take a percentage of these deposits and loan it out to people at a certain level of interest. The bank will take some of that to maintain their operating expenses. The people whom the money belongs to will get some of that for risking their capital, and then it'll be great. That's not how things work anymore. And so over time, you have fractional reserve banking and lending that's happened. And so rather than being full reserve, where there's a 1-to-1 ratio between the deposits in the bank and them the money that's lent out, or the money that's within the system, and the money that is deposited there. Now we have, for a long time, that ratio was going down significantly. So we got to a point, not too long ago, where it was like a 1 out of 10, a 1 to 10 ratio of reserves. Reserves to lending. You had 10 times as much money being lent out than there was reserves to back it up. But with COVID, when COVID happened, things really went insane. And the way that fleshed itself out was that in 2020, the government, in response to COVID, removed any or all reserve requirements for banks. So governments could there's no limit on the amount of money that they could create out of thin air to issue mortgages or other times, auto loans, whatever you want to, home equity loan, lines of credit, whatever. Like they're able to just create that money out of thin air with no backing and no reserves required. And so this is something that, again, it's just one of these things with the frog in the pot. I'm sure all of your listeners are familiar with this idea. It's you start at the beginning, it's not too bad. Okay, that's less than ideal, but it's not that big of a deal. And then over the course of 100 years, the dollar has lost 100% almost 100% of its purchasing power. And you reach no reserve, zero reserve lending, it just is kind of crazy. It gets to a point where you're like, how did we even get here?
Yeah, and I think that there are a lot of people, especially Christians in particular, that might not be very familiar with economics, even Christians that might be on the political right, that at least to a certain degree would be comfortable with the idea that banks should be a little bit looser in how they hand out loans, and that maybe they would support that process. And there are a lot of people that might think too that maybe the government should print a little bit more money because we have all these people that are poor in the United States. Why not give them more money? I think a
Sure.
lot of the fallacies behind that way of thinking go back to the fact that a lot of people do not have a very strong grasp on how money works. So maybe
Yes.
walk us
Yes.
through that first. So how does money work? And just explain to my audience, like, what is, like, we think that money, it's the green stuff in our wallet, or it's when we swipe our credit card, but it's a lot more complicated than that. So explain to my audience how money actually functions.
Yeah, well, and so this is the question. I've got a buddy. He's a pretty well known Bitcoiner and podcaster. His name is Robert Breedlove. He's basically convinced that the what is money question is going to be the question of our time. Again, I think it's going definitely to be, at the very least, one of the most consequential things. And this is why. And as a Christian, why does this matter? I'll just kind of go back to my own background. So I grew up. My parents worked for a Christian nonprofit organization. We didn't raise support. My dad was salaried, but money was always tight, right? And so when we began to raise support to go to Uruguay, Uruguay is a very secular country. It's got one of the highest percentages of atheism and agnosticism in the Western Hemisphere. And so we went there thinking that we were going to primarily plant a church in that atmosphere. When we arrived, we found that there was a wave of Venezuelan immigrants pouring into Uruguay and pouring into many of the other surrounding countries of Venezuela, Colombia and Brazil and a bunch of other ones. And the primary reason that they were flooding all these countries was because their government had hyperinflated their currency. The government had just created, they'd made promises to the people about all these great programs that they were going to do, much like you mentioned. We're going to take care of this for you. We're going to fund this, we're going to fund this. And who doesn't like getting free money? So an overwhelming majority of people voted to pursue this type of policies. But over time, the money, they did so much of that, and there was so much corruption and grift of the government officials giving money to their friends and allies and all kinds of stuff, that the money became literally worthless. And there were dumpsters, and to this day, there's dumpsters full of their paper money. And so for me, we got to see firsthand the consequence of having money that is created so easily. And so we basically saw families destroyed. We saw fathers having to leave their wives and kids in Venezuela to come to Uruguay and other countries to work a job to try to send money home. And we saw infidelity. We saw, again, fathers separated for years, for 6-7 years from their kids. Their kids are being raised by other people. There's all kinds of awful consequences of this. And so as we were ministering in this context, I was a philosophy major in college and was, just trying to understand and make heads or tails of why this was happening. And so as I began to research this, I found that, this was nothing new. What was happening in Venezuela was not something new. Almost every currency in Latin America has failed 3 to 4 times since 1971, when the United States went off the gold standard. And so this was, again, as I'm learning these things, I learned, okay, so up until 1971, gold was money, at least in some form. And then, that has its own history as well. But now, for the last 50 years, we've had, money is just paper, or it's just a digital representation that's created on a ledger by these banking institutions. And so this question really is at the core of so much of these other questions: is what is money, and how do we know, by what standard can we say that this is what money is? Who is the one who gets to define these things? And so this is really a big issue. And so I think that, again, this is the issue that for a long time has been just kind of set aside as, well, that's not practical enough. We have to, there's poor people out there. We can't talk about or think about what is money. That seems so far removed from anything that's consequential. You have had those voices in the wilderness who have been talking about these things. You have Ron Paul, God rest his soul. If this is the Christian Libertarian podcast, then he's probably somebody who's figured, importantly in the American Christian libertarian story. He's somebody who's been tooting his horn forever. There's a bunch of other Christian and or Austrian economists who have been trying to have this conversation and show the consequences of this conversation. For me, the thing that was very interesting was to find that this was not a new conversation. This is a conversation that had been happening for hundreds of years, if not thousands of years. And the book that kind of brought me to that conclusion or that realization was a book called The Ethics of Money Production by a Catholic Austrian economist named Jörg Guido Hulsmann. I cannot recommend that book enough. There's also I would say a shorter version or a more layman's version that's kind of written at a college level. There's another great book that's written by a man named Gary North, who recently went to be with the Lord. Who's a Christian Reconstructionist, Christian economist, wrote prolifically and gave away a ton of his resources about economics through a Christian lens. He wrote a book called Honest Money that I would also recommend. It's a great jumping off point. That just really asks this question, what is money and how, and from a Christian perspective, and how do you know? And so one of the things that I would look at is, so the question you have to ask is, what are the characteristics of money? And so these are things that we don't have these conversations. We're not accustomed to having these questions. We just think of money as the government creates it. It's piece of paper or whatever it is. But we really don't have, whether it's broadly as Americans or even more specifically as Christians, we don't have good answers to this question.
Yeah, walk us through. I mean, I want to get into the ethical aspect of that here in just a second, because I think it's really important to try to align the ethics of money production with our Christian values here. But before we do that, maybe talk to us about how money is produced in the United States. So we know that the Federal Reserve is the nation's central bank; they have control of the money supply. But it's not like the old days where whenever they want to print more money, they literally roll out the printers and get the paper and all that. It's more technical. It's been more digitized than that. So how does the Federal Reserve go about producing money in the American economy?
Yeah, so largely it's through debt. It's through the issuance of debt. Today, that's the largest way that money is created is through the issuance of new debt. So again, if you're going to go buy a house, again, as I mentioned prior, you're not going to go, get your community to, take some of their deposits in this bank. That's just not how it works. The bank will literally create on a spreadsheet, just create a new ledger entry of debt owed. And so then you will have to start paying that debt with your normal thing. So money is created out of thin air as debt and then repaid over time. So that's the primary way that this happens. So debt is the overwhelming way. That's the overwhelming way. You do have the Treasury who does bring out the money printers. That actually is part of the equation. But it's not the overwhelming majority of how money is created.
Yeah, and there are a lot of massive ramifications for that in the American society. And again, over the last 4 years in our response to COVID, the government has printed trillions of dollars, just completely inserted brand new money into the economy. The problem is a lot of people don't understand how these market mechanics work. And a lot of Christians are like that too. And so a lot of Christians, especially Christians that are more like center left, they blame the corporations for raising their prices, saying that they're great. I mean, that's always the go-to. And everyone in the media parrots that talking point, that the reason why there are higher prices in the American economy, and the reason why American families are suffering is because of corporate greed. So what's wrong with that narrative, and why should we have a moral framework for thinking about money production as Christians?
Yes, and that's I'll go back and kind of unpack some of the Federal Reserve's role. So again, we mentioned interest rates. So the Federal Reserve they're the body who is given the responsibility of determining what the interest rate is. The interest rate is the cost of capital. It's the level of interest that's put on loans that are offered. So, as you mentioned, there's people who, when they would like interest rates to be really low. We've experienced very low, historically low interest rates for the last since the financial crisis. And so you've had functionally lived in a world where, you could take out a home mortgage for 2% interest. So what does that mean? Where you have a hard currency, basically you would never, if you have money, you're not going to risk that money if you're only getting 2% back for it. That you're going to be much less. That's going to be a very low incentive for you to be able to do that. That level of interest is even below the what's the word, below like the regular inflation rate. Like the inflation rate is the accepted inflation rate, which is actually far higher than this, but the accepted inflation rate is about 3%, according to the CPI, which is a whole nother moving target that gets changed, and the items that are on that list get adjusted and played with in order to serve the narratives of of the Federal Reserve and other government bodies. But basically, this is something where we live in a world of scarce things. We live in a world where there's actually a cost to giving something to somebody, and at the same time that thing not being in your own possession or not being in the possession of somebody else. And so low interest rates and fiat currency, which is money that is fiat currency, is just currency that's created by dictate, based on the authority of the governing entity who's governing it, rather than being backed by something scarce. This fundamentally wants a world to exist, or tries to create a world that is really at odds with the way that the world actually operates, and that is at odds, even going further, it's at odds with the way that God designed the world to work. And so this is getting into some of the reasons why Christians should really care, and where this really gets, starts to create impacts in the Christian world.
So talk to us about that. How is this at odds with the way that God intended the world to work? Because there are a lot of people, again, just to kind of set this up for you, there are a lot of people, again, on the Christian left that would say, well, the Bible does not seem to affirm giving out loans. Which there are a million different reasons that we can qualify. You have to think about it historically and all that stuff. But that seems to be the general case people on the left make. So maybe address that, and then walk us through how the way that you have conceptualized money lines up with God's intention for creation.
Sure. Yeah. So again, this is part of the point where I got a lot of clarity on this was, I'd been a Bitcoiner for about a year. We haven't even talked about that. We don't need to talk about that right now. But I'd been a Bitcoiner for about a year, and I was pastoring our church in Uruguay. I was doing some sermon prep, and I was in the book of, I believe it's Galatians. And at the end of the book of Galatians, the Apostle Paul says that God is not mocked. For what a man sows, that will he also reap. And so it struck me that the Apostle Paul said that God has so hardwired this principle of sowing and reaping into the fabric of the universe that, in Paul's words, to deny that is to make a mockery of God. And so then, just the way that my mind works, I just started trying to run through and think about what are some other examples of sowing and reaping. And so I just began to think, okay, God says if you're not willing to work, then neither should you eat. So God says that food is designed to give strength for people who are working. It's designed to replenish the strength and energy for people who are working. And so if you're willing to work, then you should, the reaping for that is that you should get food. If you're willing to sow work, you can reap food, eating food. If you're not willing to do that, then he says you shouldn't eat, which, what is he saying by extension? You should die. He's like, God has created us to work, and we honor him by working. And if you're not willing to humble yourself and submit yourself to that reality, then you don't deserve to eat, and you deserve to have your life source cut off. This is one way that this works. Another way is that God has an order for things like marriage and childbearing. God, you sow marriage, and then you get sexuality, you get, enjoying the fruit of sex, and you also get childbearing. God doesn't do things out of those orders. He does things in a certain order that is, and when we do that, we're acknowledging and submitting ourselves, we're humbling ourselves to his design for the world. The one that really, there's a ton of these. I could go on for a very long time about this, but the one that's perhaps most gripping for Christians is salvation itself. So why is it so within Islam, for example, Allah, he can just forgive sins. This is why Muslims, when they think about the cross, it doesn't compute for them why Jesus had to die. Why did Jesus need to die? Why couldn't God just forgive their sins? In the case of the Christian God, actions have consequences. If the soul that sins must die, there has to be a payment for sin. And so, this is something we can't get away from. And so, in the same way that, in the same way of all these other things, in the message of the gospel is that God sends his son to take the punishment for our sins and to pay the debt that actually existed. And so we can't get around this world by trying to wish that away and wish away a world of scarce resources and scarce actions and scarce. I mean, we can think about this in terms of our time as well, in terms of how you use your time. You can't just, we don't have unlimited time. We don't have unlimited resources. We have to acknowledge and be good stewards of these different resources that God has put into our hands. We can't just create an unlimited supply of all of them. So this is the reason why this is such a big deal, because functionally we live in a world right now of unlimited unlimited money, and what are the consequences of living in a world with unlimited money? Unlimited government created money means that governments functionally have unlimited power. Governments functionally, like, and I tweeted this the other day. The only reason that governments can have unlimited power is because they have unlimited money. You can't fund things if you don't have the money to do them. And so if we look at historically things like wars, one of the greatest limiting factors of war has been that one of the sides of the war would eventually run out of money. And so this was a blessing for all of the people involved. Wars would cease at some point, and you'd get to enjoy peace. We've experienced decades, generations of ongoing wars that have been enabled in large part through fiat currency, through endless, easily created government money. And so this is one thing. We could also go into government-funded education. One of the reasons in which things like transgenderism and a lot of these other things have been able to be subsidized or been able to expand and grow to the prominence that they do is because the government is able to fund them through government schools. And so these things, there is a very direct relationship between the way that people, between the size of a government and the way that people, as a consequence, view that government and the source, the principles and processes that govern monetary creation. So those are a few reasons why this is a huge deal. I think more Christians should be aware of.
Those are all really good examples, and I think you set me up perfectly for my next question. As I said before, there are a lot of people that I know right now, especially, I have a lot of friends that have multiple children. You have 4 kids yourself. I have a lot of friends with 2, 3, 4 kids, and they're struggling now more than they ever have at any point in their life. And they're making more money now than they ever have at any point in their life. And a lot of them realize that something is wrong, but they just can't put their finger on what that is. And a lot of it has to do with the fact that they don't understand how the monetary system that we have in the United States works. And so I've talked to a lot of these people personally. I've been like, well, look, at the heart of all of the problems we're facing in society right now is the Federal Reserve. Like, that is the thing. It's like you said, it's fueling the wars. It's fueling the government's ability to rack up massive amounts of debt, like all of those things. But I want to get this back down to the more practical level. What is the negative impact that Federal Reserve policy has on the average American? So if you're just a family of 4 or 5 or whatever, and you're out there working, trying to make it, what toll does central banking have on your life?
Yeah. So again, as I mentioned, we live in a world of scarce goods. We live in a world of scarce time and resources. There's a scarce, limited amount of food. There's a scarce, limited amount of clothing and other goods, homes, cars, all of these things. And if the money that you are using to denominate those things can be easily created at the drop of a hat or at the just a few keystrokes on a keyboard, then of course those things denominated in that currency are going to go up in value, especially when you're in an environment like we have been with low interest rates. And so again, when there's very low interest rates, then banks and other entities can loan out money very easily, and that's what we've seen. We've seen tons of money flooding the system with COVID. The COVID was used as a justification to create, and this is there's some questions about these numbers, but the first part of COVID, the first 9 months of COVID, 40% of all the money that has ever existed, 40% of the dollars that have ever existed were created in that 9-month period or whatever it was. And then over the course of the next year and a half, through the end of President Trump's term and into President Biden's term, even more was created. And so you've got something like 80% of all the dollars that have ever created have been created in the last 4 years. And so again, a lot of us, how does this actually work out? If you look at housing prices are one of the easiest place to see something that's called the Cantillon effect. Have you heard of the Cantillon effect? Okay, so the Cantillon effect basically just says that basically as wherever money enters into the society, or when money enters into the society, the people who have first access to that money will receive a benefit of it. So you have people who are out there making economic decisions. They're trying to decide, should I buy a house now or should I wait? Should I do this or should I not? In the case of homes, you had basically in the course of a few months, you had 40% more money in the system competing for more or less the same amount of homes, cars, all of these things. And so this is why you saw the prices during the first couple of years of COVID, you saw the prices of things like homes and cars and lots of other things explode in value. It was by no means the only thing. There was also supply chain shortages, but the overwhelming majority, especially in the case of homes, was due to the Cantillon effect. It was due to the direct creation and issuance of new money into the world. You have more or less the same number of homes competing for far more dollars. And so the natural consequence of that is the dollar denominated price of those goods goes up incredibly. And so this is also it comes to bear on normal groceries and all these other kind of things. As everything becomes more expensive, then businesses have to raise their prices in order to buy more of those scarce goods, in order to pay their people for their scarce time. And so as time goes on, it's this snowball that just keeps growing, and it gets out of hand really quickly. And so this is the frustrating thing. As you mentioned, people are making, people our age, we're growing older, we're working, we're getting paid more, and yet we're falling behind in terms of the purchasing power of the money that we're making. It's shocking to a lot of people that you can be making what 10 years ago would have been a shockingly a very comfortable amount of money, and now you need far more than that in order to basically in some cases double what you thought you would have been able to operate on and be comfortable with a few years ago. So does that answer the question?
Oh yeah, no, that was perfect. That was perfect. Why do you think that so many people don't understand this? Is it just the fact that like our public school systems don't teach it? Like I said, I never heard of the Federal Reserve until I was working on my master's degree in college. Right? Is it that, or what's the reason why people so fundamentally misunderstand the role that the Federal Reserve and central banking and fiat currency plays in our current economic woes?
Yeah, well, I would say this is nothing new. There's a famous quote from Henry Ford. He says, it was something along the lines of, if the average person understood central banker or banking in general, they would be rioting in the streets tomorrow. This has been something that, this is something that a lot of the founders of the United States fought against, was the creation of a central bank, because they'd seen the effect that it had on the British economy and all these things. And so I think that, this is why I think you can go nefarious, and I think there is a certain level of nefariousness involved. There's lots of areas where and lots of places where things are made more complex in order to create jobs, or they're made more complex than they need to be because there's incentives to do that. And so, I think there's a large sense in which there's an incentive to on the part of the government for people not to understand these things, because it would have a large effect on the willingness of people to take political action in a lot of things. I think there's another thing is just that it's complex. Economics is complex, but it's nowhere near. There's plenty of things that are equally complex like there's football offenses. People that are incredibly difficult that people all the time can articulate, can unpack. It's nothing to the degree where, this is impossible to understand. But in a lot of ways by governments, it's portrayed as being this very impossible, very difficult thing to understand. Here, just trust us with it; we'll handle it. And so it gets people just turn their brains off. They're like, I can't understand all that. This is too difficult. But in reality, economics is it's just the way that everything else works. Like economics just is it operates the same way the rest of the world works. And so we're actually far more equipped to understand economics than most people think that they are.
Yeah, I completely agree with you on that. What do we do about this? How do we go about ending the Fed? I know, but short of electing Ron Paul for president,
Yes,
what do we do
amen.
to curb the power of the United States central bank? Obviously, podcasts like this are really great because I think we're getting the message out there to more and more people. And just in the last 6 or 7 months, as I've become more aware of this problem, I feel like there are more people in my life that are starting to think like, okay, yes, there might be something actually bigger going on that we need to address here. But realistically, how do we curb the power of the Fed?
Yeah, and so I mean, part of this is again part of the question would be just taking responsibility. I mean, it just comes back to taking responsibility for yourself and in your actions. And I think again, it's far more complex than that. But I think one of the things is just there's a really well known verse in the Bible where Jesus says, "Those who are well have no need of a physician. It's those who are sick, who need a physician." And so obviously that verse in its context is talking about the spiritual need. It was the people who were spiritually needy who reached out to Jesus. But the same principle applies in this case. If you don't see that there's a problem, you're not going to take any steps to pursue any kind of different answer or different action. And so I think the first thing to do is education like this, podcasts, conversations like this, where people are just able to recognize that there's a problem. And even better if they can have resources that help them see that this problem is relatively, in some ways, the extent of where we are right now is relatively new. Like this is not normal what we're experiencing right now, and so I think there's a number of resources that can help to come to that realization. I mentioned a couple: The Honest Money by Gary North and The Ethics of Money Production by Jörg Guido Holzmann. The book that I helped contribute to. Again, it's called Thank God for Bitcoin, The Creation, Corruption, and Redemption of Money. We say that tongue lightly planted in the cheek in terms of the thanking God for Bitcoin. We really do think that we should thank God for Bitcoin. But contrary to what people might think, we don't mention Bitcoin in the book until the last 2 chapters of the book. The book is largely just a historical, a very approachable, written at a 9th grade reading level introduction to what money is, the ethics of money production, the history of money and how it goes right and wrong, and then how it affects Christians, why Christians should care. And so I think that resources that can initiate and facilitate those conversations are very helpful. Again, in terms of a practical step, there's both of the books that I initially mentioned. Their big payoff was we need to go back to the gold standard. Now, I am very sympathetic to that view. I own some gold. I like gold. I think there's lots of, again, this is a long conversation, but lots of biblical reasons in which why in terms of submitting to this principle of sowing and reaping, gold absolutely does that. It absolutely does that. It's a great store of value. It serves as money very well. However, gold has some weaknesses, and several in a nutshell, a couple of those weaknesses are if you were to, let's say tomorrow, every Christian went out and they came to this realization, they're like, oh, we need scarce money, and this is a matter of submitting to God. We need scarce money. We're all going to go on the gold standard. What would happen is the price of gold would skyrocket overnight. And for months, it would skyrocket because there'd be this new pent-up demand coming out of nowhere for gold. And so what would happen is these gold companies, these companies that are producing and refining and doing all these things with gold, would be incentivized to go out and start digging up tons more new gold and refining it and creating new coins and all kinds of stuff. But over time, you would reach a point where you'd reach an equilibrium of sorts. You get to the point where, all right, supply is meeting demand, and then there's this is really how things have happened at this point. You've reached this level where equilibrium hits, and then in addition to that, there's something called the futures market, and so gold has largely been castrated and neutered by the futures market. So they can control by saying, all right, we're gonna predict that the future price of gold is this, and basically you can sit on the price of gold to a large degree. So those are the limitations with gold. Those are some of the downsides. It still is great in a lot of situations, and I'm not like a Bitcoin person who says it's the only thing. Not at all, not at all. But those are some of the limitations of gold. And another weakness is, imagine, as I mentioned, you have my friends, which this is a relatively common plight around the world, who are in places where they either don't have banking institutions, they don't have banks. How are they going to operate in gold? They're going to have to hide it underneath their mattress or dig a hole in the ground and bury it. It's just a difficult proposition for billions of people around the world. It can happen, you can use it, but it's difficult, especially if you're moving. For instance, our friends in Uruguay, many of them from Venezuela who moved to Uruguay, many of them had to walk across the border from Venezuela into Colombia. And if they're carrying even any kind of sizable amount of gold, they're going to be easy targets for theft. It's going to be really heavy. It's going to be annoying. So those are some of the limitations to using gold. Bitcoin is what, as crazy as it sounds, is a very viable alternative. It's a very actionable thing that you can do to affect the power that the Federal Reserve has, because again, basically by voluntarily choosing to use some currency other than U.S. dollars, you're creating more demand for that thing, for Bitcoin, and you're taking away some of the demand, and consequently some of the power of the U.S. dollar. And so this is one practical way that I think that that Christians should be looking at. It should be one thing that they're looking at, because again, this has lots of practical effects, but there's also spiritual impacts here. By using an effectively limitless currency, you're operating and denominating your life in a currency that lies about the nature of the world. It lies about who is actually God. Because we didn't get into this, but basically you can argue that central banking with fiat currency functionally gives governments and central banks godlike power. It functionally allows them to create reality out of thin air. And so as Christians, we have a problem with that. We call that idolatry, and we call that a lie. And so we want to denominate our lives, and we want every part of our life to be submitted to the lordship of Jesus. And so operating with a currency that is scarce, which is a whole other conversation about Bitcoin. Why is Bitcoin scarce? But it is. And so operating and submitting yourself to a currency that submits itself to these design parameters and good limitations that God has graciously put on the world brings blessing, and brings not in weird health and wealth gospel kind of ways, but it does bring blessing. This is, Tim Keller has talked a lot about this, that freedom is not the absence of restrictions or limitations. It's the presence of the right restrictions. So the fish who says, I'm going to be free, and he leaps out of the water onto the shore, finds out that absolute freedom does not free. It kills you. And so submitting ourselves, finding a currency that submits itself to that reality ought to be a high priority for Christians on a number of levels, not least of which is because as Christians, we firmly believe that we are doing the most important, some of the most important work in the world that's happening, that's going to shape eternal destinies, is going on right now. The money that people are sacrificially giving is going to fund gospel work around the world. And because of fiat currency, with every day that goes by, they're able to accomplish less and less of that work because the purchasing power of that money continues to go to zero. And so those are just some of the reasons why this matters to Christians, and some of the things that you can do about it.
Yeah, as we get ready to wrap up today, what are some other alternatives besides Bitcoin and gold? Because I know that there are a lot of people that do want to diversify their investments. And I had a guy, Adam O'Brien, I was telling you before the show, he runs a Bitcoin company up in Canada, and he came on the show a couple of months ago and explained the mechanics of Bitcoin. And I'll put a link to that in the show notes for my listeners. And he talked about the importance of just having, and he's a Christian like us, right? So he talked about the importance of having a diverse portfolio. So you have Bitcoin, you have gold; those are kind of two great investments. What else would you recommend for Christians that want to get out of the fiat system?
Yeah, and so the thing that I would say is all of these things, everything has trade-offs. Again, there's no silver bullet, for anything. So I mean, you could say something like land, okay? Like, hey, here you have land, reliable food sources. You can have all of these things, but there's trade-offs with all of these things. Land can be confiscated or eminent domain. Like gold could be in, you have Executive Order 6102, where the government declared private ownership of gold illegal. Land ownership, they could take it home. They could, again, eminent domain that as well. So all of these things, there's trade-offs. And ultimately, as Christians, our ultimate hope has to be in Jesus. Like we're not ultimately hoping that, all right, we're going to be smart enough and clever enough to solve all these problems. There comes a point where God throughout the scriptures tells Israel not to trust in horses, not to trust in princes, not to trust in in my case, I live in Florida. We've got for many people their Lord and Savior Ron DeSantis, who rescued them from the Egypt slavery of COVID. Is grateful as we can be for free people in these situations. And again, as soberly as we can take these things. I still do think we really need to take seriously that God is sovereign over these things, and we want to prioritize and steward resources in ways that God has defined. And so one of the things I would do is give to your church. I would support missionaries. These are in terms of storing up treasures, not just on and protecting your purchasing power, not just on earth but eternally in heaven. I would say those are two things. But yeah, I mean, I think the education of your children, this is another thing that a lot of people don't think about in terms of monetary terms. But for thousands of years, almost all of human history, people's retirement plan was their kids. They anticipated working hard with their kids and their kids having a productive household. And so that would be another thing I would say, like, what skills can you teach yourself? What skills can you invest in learning so that you are a more anti-fragile individual? So again, there's probably a lot of other things, but those are some of the ones that I would recommend for people.
Yeah, I loved it. You've already given a couple of great book recommendations, and I am going to put the links to both of those books in the show notes. And also, I'm going to get on Amazon after this and buy me a copy of both of them as well, because they sound incredible. But like you said before, this is a complicated issue. So for people that want to learn more about this, what are some resources that you would recommend people go out and find?
Yeah. So in terms of Bitcoin, again, in terms of you said you had the other episode where the guy got into more of the nuts and bolts of Bitcoin. I can do that, but that's obviously not what we've talked about here, and that's not the only reason why Christians should care. There's tons of reasons, as we've expanded on at length. The magnum opus of Bitcoin books is called the Bitcoin Standard. It's a bigger book. It's very extensive. But it's approachable. It's not impossible to read. It is by far the most widely recommended, the most widely read. Of reviews on Amazon. It's a fantastic book. So that's one book. If you're looking for the big picture Bitcoin deep dive about what Bitcoin is and how it works, that's one. There's another book that just is getting ready to come out that's based on a series of essays that's called Gradually Then Suddenly. That's another one I would look at. It's by a guy named Parker Lewis. There's a number of them. There's something called the Little Bitcoin Book. That's another good intro, short intro to Bitcoin by one of my co-authors of Thank God for Bitcoin named Jimmy Song. I mean, there's a growing number of books in the Bitcoin stable, but I think those are a great place to start.
Yeah, well, Jordan Bush, man, I really appreciate you coming on the show to talk about this today. This is awesome. Before I let you go, where can people find your work and follow you?
Yeah. And again, really appreciate you having me on the show. I don't take that for granted. It's a blessing to meet other Christians who are in the space and who are just working to help people be, think faithfully and live faithfully for the glory of God and the good of people everywhere. So you can find as far as TGFB, you can go to tgfb.com. We have podcasts. We've got, you can find our podcasts anywhere, on any of the larger podcast things. So Spotify or Apple, you can find us on there. I host a podcast called Thank God for Bitcoin, which is just introducing or interviewing Christians, primarily Christians, about Bitcoin, or just people who are in the different aspects of the world about Bitcoin and the role Bitcoin plays in their lives. I also host if you thought something could be more niche than Bitcoin, the Thank God for Nostr podcast. Nostr is this nascent, decentralized social media protocol that's funded by, there's like a bunch of development going on right now. Probably one of the biggest people who's funding it is Jack Dorsey, the former CEO of Twitter. He's actually like funding a number of Twitter competitors and working just trying to produce freedom technologies. And so Nostr is another one of these. Then you can also at tgfb.com/store, and then you can find more detail on our website. We have our biggest event of the year. We do a 2-day conference. This year it's going to be in July 24th and 25th in Nashville, Tennessee. We are going to do, basically day one is going to be unpacking a robust Christian vision of economics and monetary policy. What is money? A lot of the things that we've talked about, we're going to get into. And then day two is basically applying these things to Bitcoin and looking at all of these overtly Christian, obviously Christian things that we've talked about and seeing what Bitcoin has to do with those things. And there's way more overlap than people would imagine. So you can find out more information about the conference there. The best place to find me is on Twitter. It's where we met. So my handle on Twitter is at JM, as in Michael, Bush, B-U-S-H, and then W-R-I-T-E-S, JM Bush Writes. And so, yeah, would love to interact with any of the listeners and answer any questions I can.
Perfect. Well, I'm going to put links to all of that in the show notes here. Jordan, thanks so much for coming on today.
All right. Appreciate you. Hope to talk soon.
Thank you for listening to another episode of the Protestant Libertarian Podcast. If you have any questions or comments, please reach out to me at theprotestantlibertarian@gmail.com. You can also find me on Twitter. You can follow me at the handle @ProLibertyPod. Again, that is @ProLibertyPod. And you can also visit me at theprotestantlibertarianpodcast.com. At theprotestantlibertarianpodcast.com, you can also support the Christians for Liberty Network and the Libertarian Christian Institute. Thank you guys so much for listening to this episode, and we will see you next Tuesday.